American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military.
I supported the war at the time. I supported the war at the time not so much because I believed that Iraq will be transformed into a future Switzerland in the Middle East, but because I believed that on balance the menace emanating from the Iraqi regime was far worse than the dangers.
I believed, and I'm on record as saying, that I thought it was a strategic mistake. And I have to say, I thought it was a mistake that would be rectified more quickly than it has been. I thought it was a strategic mistake because Saddam actually was containable. He was a nuisance, but he didn't make any real strategic difference in the Middle East. I thought it was a mistake because the United States would be seen as intervening in a Muslim country, albeit against a very, very unpopular leader. But nevertheless, this was different to 91, where we were throwing Saddam out of Kuwait that he had invaded. This was going into the heart of another country for reasons that were, to be honest, ambiguous, and that's got to be a strategic mistake.
Like many others, indeed like most intelligence agencies around the world, I also believed him to be in possession of weapons of mass destruction.
I was asked live on television on the second Sunday of the war, would we find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And I said, no, I don't think we would. On the other hand, I thought there'd be some evidence of something. I knew there weren't nuclear weapons there. I thought there would be traces of chemical weapons. I thought there would be some chemical weapons stocks, but not a chemical weapons program. I think I was right in essence on that, but I was wrong about the detail. There was absolutely nothing there. I fully expected the Allies to produce some report afterwards with 60 or 70 pieces of evidence, circumstantial evidence, fragmentary evidence. They came up with zilch, with zero. And so the extent of the bereft case on which war was based, I think was a surprise certainly to me. I did expect the Allies to cross a line at some point where local Iraqi units might use chemical weapons. I expected that to happen, and even that didn't happen. But I was confident the Iraqis did not pose a weapon of mass destruction threat to the region or to the world at large. I mean, that was an absurd claim.
Well, clearly the war itself worked. I mean, people tend to forget that the Rumsfeld doctrine, that it is possible to have a lightning offensive without much air cover, without an enormous amount of logistical backup, proved to be correct. In purely, strictly military terms, that actually worked. Let us not forget that the American military performed very well in the initial phases. The entire country of Iraq was brought to its knees in exactly 21 days, better than any armchair general could have predicted at the beginning of the war. So in strictly military terms, they were able to sustain the subsequent operations for a very long period of time. The casualties were great, but not as great as one could have expected. And so, in many respects, the execution, the military execution, was right. And I don't think one could trace the beginning of a decline of the United States as a result of it. What one could trace, however, is the end of the optimism that was born at the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, when the United States was the sole superpower, everything seems possible. Whatever Washington desired was achieved.
There were 4 phases to the operation. Phases 1, 2, and 3 were going into Iraq, taking over Iraq. Phase 4 was rebuilding Iraq. And Tommy Franks, the American Allied commander, had no time for Phase 4. He wasn't interested. He said, it's not my job. I'm a soldier. I just kick the door in. My job is not to build up the country again. And that ability to ignore what happens next is almost criminal negligence. And we all made that mistake. And it's not because people were not talking about Phase 4. I myself was involved in a series of meetings that took place every week. And the result of those meetings were fed in through the Cabinet Office, and they went, we understand, to Tampa in Florida. They went to the States, and there were meetings where we were posed an exam question to say, what do you think about this aspect of Iraq? What do you think about that aspect of Iraq? And we were creating ideas about a post-conflict Iraq, and we were doing that right up to the outbreak of hostilities. And lots of other people were doing the same. There was a report which predicted that in the chaos of the fall of Baghdad, that the museums might well be looted, and something needed to be done to prevent that. There was no shortage of thinking about what might happen at the end of hostilities. But none of that thinking, none of it, was put into the military plans that CENTCOM at Tampa then initiated. One of the most interesting failures in the Iraq conflict was the enormous amount of specific military intelligence that we had. After all, we've been looking at the Iraqis for over 10 years in great detail. But the complete failure of strategic intelligence. So Western intelligence chiefs, they had the mobile phone numbers of Republican Guard commanders. They were able to send them text messages telling them to surrender and letting them know, of course, they knew who they were, where they lived, who their families were. That was an immense achievement in terms of psychological warfare. That was amazing intelligence. But we didn't know how bad the power stations were. We didn't understand how lousy the Iraqi infrastructure had become. We didn't have much clue about the social tensions inside Iraq. And we somehow believed that the Iraqis would bounce back into robust economic health once the war was over, like Germany and Japan after 1945. That was a phenomenal failure of strategic intelligence. We spent all our time being clever on the Iraqi military and none of our time understanding the society. I think the lack of preparation for the post-conflict phase in Iraq has created a legacy that leads us to worry about it in other operations. But worrying about it isn't the same as doing something about it. And although we are more wary now of military operations and the continuing commitment that they will imply, we still don't necessarily have the time or the money or the willpower to really carry it through. And so, in a sense, if I'm being cynical, I would say we've identified the mistakes, but we are more self-consciously making them now. We're not as bad as we were. Iraq was an egregious case of both strategic and tactical naivety. We're not that bad since, but we've not been nearly as good as we should have been. In a sense, we have learned some of the lessons of Iraq, but we haven't always embedded those lessons in our practice. And if there is one thing we want to learn from that, it is that if you're going to go in for military force, then you've got to go in for the whole 9 yards. You've got to do all of the planning through to the other side of military operations, and a long way the other side of military operations. And I think that's a lesson that we are still relearning in Afghanistan.
I think that the Iraq war has absolutely nothing to do with the import or the export of democracy in the Middle East. I think the two processes took place quite separately. Indeed, all the revolutionaries of the Arab Spring, the last place that they looked at for any kind of inspiration was Iraq. In that respect, a lot of people, particularly in the United States, it's fair to say, not in the jaded Europe, but particularly in the United States, were wrong to believe that one could export democracy on the tips of a bayonet to any country in the world.
I don't really believe that the Iraq conflict had any effect on the Arab Spring one way or another. I think the Arab Spring is a generational change. It started somewhere else, it started in North Africa, and it's been driven by middle-class aspirations, even though it will be taken over by Islamic radicalism, at least in the short term. But where the 2003 war does play into the Arab Spring is in the way in which it's left Iraq in a much more volatile state. And so as the Arab Spring has the effect of destabilizing autocracies throughout the Middle East, this chaotic autocracy, which is actually now this sort of vaguely democratic but mainly autocratic thing we call Iraq, with a Kurdish region that could very, very easily become independent if they thought they could get away with it in relation to Turkey. All of that means that the Arab Spring will have a bigger effect on Iraq than it ever would have before 2003. And remember, Iraq is next door to Syria. If the Syrian conflict becomes deeply sectarian, if that sectarianism spreads next door to Iraq, then we are looking at a power vacuum and enormous suffering and hiatus in the very core of the Levant. And that hasn't happened yet, but I have to say I don't think we're too far away from it.
There's no question that Iran has been handed a great success as a result of this operation. As it were, this was the unintended consequence of the Iraq war. First, because a sworn enemy of Iran in the region has simply been knocked out, and even if the knockout has been temporary for 10 years, it's already quite a substantial amount of time. Secondly, because it has allowed the rise of a Shia-dominated government in Iraq, which, although it cannot be seen as being synonymous with Iran, clearly has some affinities with the government in Tehran. So in that respect, I suspect that the Iranian government has gained a lot without having to do very much. However, I do not buy the argument that Iran has acquired a complete new ally in Iraq. The differences between Iran and Iraq are deep, they are linguistic, they are racial, quite frankly. One is Arab, the other one is Farsi, but ultimately the problem is that if Iraq wants to remain dominated by the Shia, it cannot be within the original borders of the country. So either it chooses to stay together, in which case an accommodation with Sunnis and Kurds will have to be reached, or it does not wish to give up the Shia control, in which case the country will break up. So I don't think it's a simple victory for Iran in the way it is portrayed today.
The net effect of the war has created some strategic change. It has weakened the West's hold over Middle East diplomacy, or the West's influence in Middle East diplomacy. It's certainly weakened the United States' influence in the Middle East. And it has increased in a sense, the power of the civil war between Shia and Sunni in the Middle East. And I think the 2003 war has had the effect of initiating some significant strategic change in the region where many previous wars didn't.